Yes, so welcome to our panel number 3 on working time reduction and the intensification of work. One of the main problems with the reduction of working time is the intensification of work. As the experiences, for example, with the implementation of the 35 hours week in 1984 in Germany by collective agreement, or in 2000 in France by law, showed a reduction of hours without agreed personnel compensation only leads to the retention or creation of new jobs for half of the shortened hours. The other half goes towards intensification of work because the same staff does the same work in fewer hours. As the wage compensation can almost be paid by the gain of productivity connected with working time reduction, the personal compensation has predominantly to be paid by the entrepreneurs and is therefore much more difficult to achieve. On the other hand, experiences like the British one with the 100-80-100 principle behind the introduction of the 4-day week seem to show that a reduction of hours without personal compensation can be achieved also without intensifying the work by improving of communication and work processes and reducing sickness and fluctuation. However, there are work processes such as in nursing for which a reduction in working hours without staff compensation is difficult to imagine. Now we have the pleasure of hearing from Grace Western, Ágúst Ólafur Ágústsson, and Francisca Mullens, 3 proven experts in these questions from the Autonomy Institute in London, from the advisory staff of the Icelandic Union of Practical Nurses, that's right, and from the Vrije Universiteit Brussels about the British, Icelandic, and Belgian attempts to deal with or avoid intensification of work with or without staff compensation. And afterwards, we look forward for the discussion with the competent audience. Please, Grace, it's yours.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Margareta, and thanks so much to the network for having me. It's great to be here alongside these wonderful panelists and with you all, and really excited to talk about work intensification today. So as Margareta shared, my name is Grace Western. I'm a researcher and consultant at the Autonomy Institute, where I focus on working time reduction and shorter working weeks. And I work closely with workers, organizations, and governments from various sizes and sectors, mainly across the UK, but not limited to. But today I'm going to focus on the results, as Margareta mentioned, from the UK 2022 4-day week pilot and what we learned about work intensification and work time reduction on that pilot, as well as a follow-up study that we conducted a year later with those participants, and as well as other organizations we also work with. So, sorry, I can talk slower. Thank you, Margareta. I will talk slower. Just give me a wave if I've increased again. So in 2022, as many of you know, in the UK, there was a 4-day week pilot of 61 companies and around 3,000 workers that took place for 6 months. So the design of the trial itself involved 2 months of preparation for organizations and companies which included a really broad range from diverse sectors and sizes, were not required to rigidly deploy one specific form. So the not one size fits all, again, has returned into this panel, as long as pay was maintained at 100% and employees had a meaningful reduction in work time. So it could be 10 to 20% reduction. So we conducted surveys along the way, as well as interviews, which is when I take us back into the work intensification part. That's where that comes from, but I'll signpost when we get there. But so a strong majority of these organizations and companies did not hire additional staff to make this transition, as Margareta was talking about, though there were a few instances where a few organizations decided they would to be able to facilitate the working time reduction, and a few other companies that were also willing to take potentially a revenue hit to be able to facilitate this. However, the majority of these organizations were hoping that the 4-day week or the shorter working week, however they applied it, would instead kind of spearhead cultural shifts within the organization and adaptations to ways of working that would either increase productivity or find systems efficiencies or ways to kind of create a collective change within the organization or company itself, rather than kind of putting the onus on individual workers to increase their productivity alone. I will say that this isn't necessarily possible in all organizations or companies to reduce working time without additional staffing or resources, but this is from the perspective of this trial and the organizations that we had. So I will also talk about the kind of necessary conditions to be able to facilitate this shift that aren't also increasing to work intensification. So within the pilot, we saw that roughly 2/3 of staff did not register an overall increase in work intensification. In fact, 1/3 of them registered a decrease in work intensification, but 1/3 did say that work intensification happened. So a caveat here is when paired in the survey, as well as the qualitative engagements in interviews, not all people who marked work intensification noted it as a negative thing. Instead, they corresponded it to, well, I'm better rested, I feel better at work, so I'm just kind of managing my time better. So yes, you could say that it's work intensification, but I don't see that as a negative. And then of course there were also just negatives of work intensification. So important to kind of caveat that there are nuances there. And also we did see where work intensification was reported that the organizations that had kind of the least amount of prep time and kind of dedication to the cultural shift tended to see the higher work intensification in their individual workers. So that's a really important thing to hit on. So when we conducted a follow-up study a year later, we invited all 61 organizations to take part in our research, and we heard from roughly half of them who engaged with our research. And so within the survey, we conducted across the organizations, of which we had roughly 294, I say roughly, but I'm giving you the exact number, 294 respondents. We had 20 who reported work intensification, so that's roughly 7% of respondents. And these were mainly negative in many ways, just kind of anxiety that the day would then get pulled from them if they weren't maintaining output, things that we think about often when we think about work intensification. However, again, in some of the qualitative interviews, there was some variation in terms of how that was reported. Some people said, yes, I am maybe working, my workday is a bit fuller, but I actually have less work-related anxiety, either due to kind of, I'm more focused, I'm more productive, I'm less stressed about what I'm getting done. So not to kind of overhit that point, because I think there was, a strong sense that overwork is negative, but there was some kind of nuance there. So kind of from these engagements that we heard in the pilot, as well as the follow-up study, and in the work that we also do with organizations and other kind of companies, mainly in the UK, but not limited to, there's kind of 4 key elements that we think of that help limit work intensification. So one of those, as I've already mentioned, is that adequate preparation and that collective cultural shift. So that kind of really means kind of both management and staff buy-in. So it's not kind of a top-down approach where it is implemented on workers. Workers have to work to this very specific model with very specific outputs. And instead, they are part of the conversation about why this shift is taking place, what are the expectations, and what are the desired outcomes. And so in that way, it's really a co-design of the model and centers workers' experience as workers know their work best. As has been said many times today, there's also no one-size-fits-all approach. So that can be within an organization or a company, but that can also mean across sectors. So potentially in a single organization, you're going to have different models for how that work time reduction is happening. Say you have colleagues who are, frontline staff, they might need a much more flexible approach than potentially people who are in the back office. And also we see kind of important to that are clear metrics of success. And so workers know how they're being assessed. If there's kind of this understanding where it's kind of ambiguous, I'm stressed because are they going to take this away from me, you know, depending on how, from the perspective of where this and who implemented this, that also can lead to work intensification where everything feels like it must be done within a small amount of time. And that kind of leads into clear organizational and strategic prioritization. If that kind of shifts where many organizations and companies are like, everything's important, but if you move to a work time reduction, what actually is the priority? And how is that being communicated? And do workers have agency and power and trust to be able to manage their own workload in kind of relevant organizations where that's possible, to then be able to prioritize effectively in that same way? So again, this really lends to a collective cultural shift rather than that individualized pressure. Sorry, am I too loud or slow? Slow, great. Thank you for the feedback. And, you know, as mentioned, there are, as everyone here knows, you know, significant benefits to work time reduction that can impact productivity generally, or performance, you know, higher well-being, better sleep, all these things, a happier life that can just then make your experience at work different, which can then account for some of that work time reduction, though that should definitely be monitored in case there's kind of a shift there, or if that leads into work intensification. As has also been mentioned, kind of the impact of retention and recruitment. If you are saving time on, a very arduous hiring process and then onboarding, and you're retaining that institutional knowledge, all of that lends to kind of saving some time. We saw in the pilot itself, the number of staff that left companies during that time dropped by 57%. In the follow-up study, we saw that 50% of organizations also saw positive effects on reducing their staff turnover. For recruitment, the pilot, people also reported improvements in hiring, and in the follow-up study, 32% said the policy had noticeably improved their recruitment. And then, of course, other things that have been discussed are other logistical considerations around sickness reduction, where we saw a 65% reduction in sickness leave over the course of the 2022 trial. So, all to say, and slowly, adequate preparation, kind of collective buy-in, co-design, all of these are really integral pieces to ensuring that there isn't work intensification in the sectors and in the organizations and companies where that is relevant and possible, though that is not possible within all sectors without additional resources or additional staffing. And so it is important to kind of note that as well, and not kind of assume that just higher productivity gains can be assessed for everything. Anyways, thank you all, and I will pass it on now.
Yes, thank you so much, Grace. And I pass now to Ágúst.
Yes. Is it? Okay, I'm on. Good afternoon. My name is Ágúst. I'm a former member of the Icelandic Parliament. I also used to be a consultant at the United Nations in New York. Today I'm a university teacher, but today I represent the Union of Licensed Practical Nurses. Little background in the beginning. Historically, Iceland has had one of the longest working hours in Europe. However, Iceland has now been at the forefront of the debate on reducing working hours with successful experiments in reducing the standard work week. The Icelandic trials on reducing working hours began almost 10 years ago and continued through 2019, involving roughly 1% of the country's working population. So for workers, the work reduction translated into a change from the traditional 40-hour work week to 36-hour work week, and a possibility of 32-hour work week for those working in shifts without losing any pay. Another example, for people that were in 80% employment percentage, changed into 100%, so the salaries for those people increased without more work for them. So they got 100% salaries for a work that used to be 80%. But after these trials, we did look at the results. So number one of the critical findings from Iceland trials is that the reduced working hours did lead to an increase in productivity, in most cases at least. Number two, it increased job satisfactions amongst workers in Iceland. Employees felt more fulfilled, reducing the likelihood of burnout. Number three, employees reported feeling more focused, leading to fewer errors and more efficient work. And number four, reducing hours encouraged management and staff to identify and eliminate unnecessary tasks and to streamline processes. And five, the final one, employees with better work-life balance and lower stress levels were less likely to take a sick leave in Iceland. Furthermore, we at the Trade Union of Licensed Practical Nurses in Iceland did a survey 2 years ago that showed almost 90% of our members were very or rather satisfied in their work. However, about half of them believed that their workplace needed more manpower and more staffing to maintain the sufficient level of service at their workplace. It is very important to note that this feeling of not enough staffing was already in case before the reduction of the working week. Additionally, the COVID pandemic obviously had a huge impact on jobs in healthcare during these times, during these trials. So, dear colleagues, so after these good results from the trials, we implemented in 2021 shorter work week for everyone, especially if you work in the government or at the local level. However, let's now look at if the working time reduction led to intensification of the work, particularly in the demanding sector like healthcare. What were the main concerns? Number one, employees may feel that the same amount of work need to be completed in less time, leading to intensified work pace and stress during working hours. That was the case. At some of the workplaces in Iceland. Number two, workers might be required to handle multiple tasks at the same times, which can lead to errors and decrease quality of work. Number three, in some cases, the need for the job cannot wait though the employee has left the job. This is especially a hot topic regarding jobs in healthcare and schools and the welfare system. If you work behind a desk, it can be very easy to leave your task until the next morning, but you cannot leave a patient or a child that need a care. Number four, the working time reduction could make the problem of not having enough staff even worse than before. And the final point, the final concern, additionally, the employees could be asked to take on an additional responsibilities to compensate for the reduced working hours of their colleague. This last point was recently highlighted by people working in daycares and kindergarten in Iceland. Because speaking of daycare, it is important to note that the reduction of working hours has been much better implemented in public jobs in Iceland, so parents that do not work in the public sector might still have a long working hours and are therefore in a need for a longer daycare for their children. So this has caused some difficulties in this area. Additionally, we saw that the reduction of working hours had the effect that our shift people, our nurses in the healthcare, were in some cases needed to come more often to work, sometimes for a shorter time in each cases. And this caused some unhappiness about this implementation. Of course, there's a need to redistribute tasks effectively to ensure that the reduced hours do not lead to an overload on specific individuals or shifts. In healthcare, this could mean hiring additional staff to assist with routine tasks. This also means focusing more directly on patient care and reducing administrative burdens that could be handled by supportive staff or through automation and technology. While the Icelandic experience provided a positive outlook on managing working intensification, several factors can influence whether a working time reduction leads to an increased workload pressures. So let's finally look at some solutions. Number one, in organizations with a culture that values employee well-being and efficiency, there is a greater likelihood of proactively managing work intensification. Number two, well-trained managers need to understand the implications of reduced working hours and be proactive in adjusting workloads, expectations, and set realistic targets. And number three, of course, we need, in some cases, and in many cases, we need to hire more people additionally and start to make public jobs, especially in healthcare, more attractive through wages. Voluntary overtime needs to be compensated, and in that regard, we in Iceland implemented an incentive program for people that were willing to take various different types of shifts at the time of the working reduction time. Number four, open communication with the employees about the goals of the working time reduction and involving them in the decision making can lead to a better outcomes. Employees are more likely to support and adapt to changes when they understand the rationale behind them and have a say in how those changes are implemented. Number five, the final point, this is more flexibility for the workplace to implement the change has been a good thing, but it also giving employees more control over their work. This can help to reduce the feeling of work intensification, inclusive decision-making, transparent communication, and autonomy helps employees manage their time effectively. So to conclude, generally speaking, the experience from Iceland has been positive. Nobody wants to go back. However, without careful planning, there is a risk of work intensification which can influence the benefits. By focusing on workload management, effective use of technology and incentives, supportive management practices, sufficient staffing, and fostering a positive organizational culture, organizations can ensure that the time working reduction leads to a positive outcomes for both employees and the patients without intensification. Therefore, the key to success, in my opinion, is careful planning, effective management of workloads, and continuous monitoring of both employee well-being and patient care quality. However, we may never underestimate the need for a proper staffing that is the cornerstone of a good and safe care. And that is, my friend, necessary whether we reduce the working week or not. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Ágúst. And now we come to Francisca Mullens and some Belgian experiences.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, this works. A lot has been said, so I hope I can add some additional insights. I'm a postdoc researcher. My PhD research was fully on one case study in Belgium, a working time reduction case study in a feminist organization, a nonprofit organization who trialed a 30-hour work week instead of a 36 full-time work week before. And the interesting part of this study or their trial is that they started from a feminist point of view. In the last panel, we've heard a lot about these feminist thinking points and where they come from, and that's also where they've come from. They've built on a long legacy in Belgium of the feminist organizations demanding a shorter work week. They've also thought about like shorter days or fewer days a week, and that like the rationale behind it was a better combination of paid and unpaid work, gender equality. That's what they wanted to achieve. That's what they saw as a solution for the problem society-wide. But of course, they can't change society, so they trialed it themselves to have more power behind their message. Important to say is that it's a feminist organization. It was mainly women working in the organization. There was one man working there at the time. Today, there's 2 men working in the organizations. About 60 employees in total, so smaller organization, and they're mostly knowledge workers, so high-skilled knowledge workers, which is important to say also. They trialed the shorter work week for 1 year in 2019, so 5 years ago, but they now, since 2022, permanently reduced their working time to 32 hours. So the trial was 30 hours, now it's 32 hours. The 3 main principles for them was the salary retention, so salary remained the same, preserving organizational goals, and no increase in individual work pressure. So that's important. How did they get their goals done with no individual work pressure? They thought about it. They did a reorganization of work. They changed to self-managing teams. I don't know if many people work in self-managing teams. It's not easy. So there were some difficulties for some teams, the self-managing teams. So they did the organization-wide reorganization, rethought some job functions, tasks, but they also hired new people. So 70% of the minus hours, they say, like the hours that were reduced, were substituted by new hires or were outsourced. But 30% wasn't, and that they had like an efficiency gain on several levels, like the organizational level, the reorganization, the team level, the self-managing teams didn't always work that well. And then on the individual level, we saw some strategies, some individual strategies to focus more, prioritization, monotasking, all these things. Some results of, so I did an in-depth study. I did it for 4 years. So we have a lot of data gathered, survey data, longitudinal before, during the trial, time use data. So we know exactly how much time they spend on all types of categories, not only work, but also private activities. And I did in-depth interviews and focus groups. So I have a lot of information, but I'm not gonna say it all. But what we find during the shorter work week, both in the trial, but also now in the 32-hour work week, is they're more satisfied with their work pressure. So it's hard to measure work pressure. We can ask like, how satisfied are you? Do you experience more or less work pressure? And we see that they're more satisfied. We see like there's one measurement in October somewhere that they were less satisfied, but taking into account the context factors, a lot of colleagues were sick, absent, so that adds to the work pressure of the other colleagues. There was a time where there was no management. Of course, that adds to the work pressure. So we control for these things. And in general, they're more satisfied with their work pressure. They're also more satisfied with the energy level they have left at the end of the day. Important to say is they could choose how they reduce their weekly hours. So they could choose for 4 days or 5 shorter days. That were like mainly the option, or a combination. A lot chose the combination, but most chose some sort of 4-day week with 2 shorter days, 2 longer days, or 4 even days. So that's important to mention also. But still, they felt more satisfied with the energy level at the end of the day. About 80% believed in the shorter work week that they could retain or remain in this regime until their retirement age. It's also important to think like long term. How is it possible to work like this much for like 30 years? And that in comparison with about 26% before the trial that said like, oh, I feel I can handle this until retirement. So it's a big difference. And then we worked at work tempo, what we call, and we see that it did not increase. It hasn't decreased, but it remained more or less the same. But I think you mentioned it as well. That doesn't mean that they didn't feel the need to work more efficiently, but that doesn't mean they feel like it is a negative thing. But they felt like I need to rethink how I do my work, focus more, put off my emails that I can really focus for a few hours. So they did do that, but the tempo has not increased. However, what I did find, especially in the focus, in the in-depth interviews, and then I translated it into survey questions for the next round, is that they felt, especially like the creative strategic thinkers in the organization, they felt they had less white space, I call it, or slack time, which is also important for some jobs. And that was less because they prioritized, like they really thought like, I only have 30 hours, I have to do this, so I can't like just go to that networking event or that meeting that might be interesting or that conference that might be interesting, or just look at it, out of the window and like think a little bit, which is also important. They did feel like there was less time for that and less time for informal contacts and coffee breaks. And you could say like, that's not very important, but it is important in organizations to have informal contacts between colleagues. And we also saw in COVID that there was not much room for that, but it's important as an organization that colleagues see each other in informal ways as well. It doesn't have to be a long time, but you have a chat like, how are you doing work-wise, but also private-wise. That's important to know how your colleagues are feeling. That's the work part. And as we saw, like the feminist thinkers here, we know like the connection to non-work is also important, like the unpaid work, leisure time. So I look at both things and I connect these dots. And what we see is an important decline in work-family conflict, which was also an aim of the organization. So this is really important. They felt less time pressure in their leisure time. They experienced sufficient leisure time. They did less multitasking in unpaid work. And if we talk about intensification of work, we can also talk about intensification of unpaid work. And that we see that they had less intensified, they combined less tasks. So they multitasked less, they felt more satisfied, fulfilled during these tasks. They felt like, I can do this at an easier pace. I can do it when the children are not home, very different. Doing unpaid work when your children are home, I think, compared to when they are running around. So they felt like, I feel I can do this with more in a relaxed way, and that feels very good. So I think it's important to, when we talk about intensification, because that's often an argument against the shorter work week, to take the full workday into account, and also the private sphere and how they connect, because there is a spillover from work to private sphere, and private sphere, of course, to your work sphere. And me especially, I'm a time use researcher, actually. I think it's important to look at the different dimensions of time. We often talk about duration, which is an important dimension of time when we reduce the duration of weekly work time. But I think it's also important to talk about timing. Tempo is the intensification, and sequence, but especially timing. And that's what we have here with the white collar worker. They're often very flexible, have autonomy over their time, and that's very good. But a lot of people don't have that. And you could wonder, like, should we pay more attention to the duration of work time or to the timing of work time, that they have more flexibility, autonomy over their time? So I think that's important to of course, we want to have both, but yeah, if we have to think about that, it's important to take into account, because these FEMA is the organization, workers, they were time and place independent. They could work from home, they could choose their hours. So in combination with the shorter work week, of course, this is the ideal scenario, but a lot of people don't have these options. So I think that's it from my side. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Francisca. And before we now come to the questions, I would ask Grace still to say which kind of sectors the 61 enterprises came in the British pilot, because we listened now in the science work, it's relatively easy, and public sector is also maybe more easy. And please say.
Yes, absolutely. So for the 61 companies, the kind of most popular sector that was in that bundle was we had advertising and marketing, so very specific kind of white collar workers. So that was kind of the highest representation. The third highest representation was nonprofits. So again, kind of white collar workers. There were some other kind of manufacturing. We had a few restaurants. So there was a range, but it was very much predominantly based on kind of the organizations that did tend towards white collar of, kind of marketing, advertising, nonprofits. So yeah, very important to kind of note that within the context, but not exclusively. So
did I understand well, almost white collar and few industry and manufacturing?
Yeah, fewer, but yes, so not that.
But there were some industry.
There were, yeah, and we kind of captured more of that in some of the qualitative engagements, so they weren't kind of drowned out in the surveys, and they still saw positive benefits to the shorter working week, and that also really depended on the model as well. So I'm thinking of a fish and chip shops that we worked with, and they moved to an annualized model approach. So during the summer, when they had kind of more business, they worked longer hours, which they then made up for with shorter hours in the winter. And so saw kind of those benefits, but obviously the benefits did tend to accrue when they were working those shorter hours in the winter. So yes, that's definitely a slant towards the white collar workers.
Okay, thank you so much. Then please, Katrin.
Hi. Katrin Mohr from IG Metal in Germany. Thank you very much for the insights. I have a question to Ágúst and to Francisca. Ágúst, you stressed the point of you have to staff no matter whether you reduce working time or not. And in that case, you were talking about, is there staff on the labor market you could actually hire to compensate, because we have this problem of labor, skilled labor shortage a lot, and probably you have that too. Maybe you can elaborate on this question a bit. And then you stressed that it's for the public sector, and I'm wondering, is there a spillover of the discussion to other sectors or industries, and is there like movement from the unions or whatever to transfer this experience to other sectors? Because you said they very much, everybody likes it and nobody wants to change it anymore, and has this an impact on the societal discussion and on other sectors? That would be my question to you. And to Francisca, you said that the NGO compensated for 70% of the hours that's been reduced via staffing or outsourcing, and I was wondering how they financed this, because I mean NGOs, they get their money from the state sometimes, from funding, from that would be interesting, because I mean in the end somebody has to pay for it.
Okay, two questions from the audience online. One question to Ágúst. Have you seen a reduction of cost on the healthcare system in Iceland due to the increase of health of individuals? And a question for all of the three speakers. Can one know whether work intensification is getting to levels that can be harmful? Is there any other way of measuring work intensification apart from asking people to self-report, speed of work, etc.?
Thanks. Thanks to all the panelists across the day and the organisers too. I'm Adrian Prandall from the National Education Union in the UK. We've heard that employers accommodate work time reduction by productivity gains, changing work organisation, or by accessing the labour market and increasing the workforce. In the public education sector, of course, employers don't have control over growing their income, similarly to the comment that's just been made about not-for-profits as well. To support these costs, finances are typically very tight. In UK schools, we're dealing with not only with a working hours crisis, but also a labour supply crisis. So the high hours and stagnating pay have a big effect on retaining teachers. They have an effect on recruiting new teachers as well. So it's very difficult for education institutions to keep their workforce at a minimum or a desirable size. So I suppose that leaves the organisation of work, and there are some barriers there in the education sector, but in other sectors as well. So I'm interested in what the examples are for negotiating working time reduction when productivity or access to the labour market are not easy for employers to achieve, but also where there are significant barriers to reorganising work, whether those barriers are perceived or real. I think in the education sector we have both perceived barriers and real barriers.
Yes, thank you. Regarding the question from Katrina, sorry, about the staffing, obviously we need more people in the welfare system and the healthcare. We see it in Iceland in the next 20 years, the number of elderly people are going to double in Iceland. But in the last 10 years, we have doubled the foreign workforce in Iceland. So we have imported a lot of people, mainly from Europe, obviously, because we are part of the European Economic Agreement. We are not part of the EU, as many of you know. But we have imported a lot of people to maintain, to take part of this need of staffing in the welfare system. So now we have almost 1/4 of the people working in Iceland overall is foreigners. So we have tried to find a solution in that regard, but obviously that's a long-term solution. So that's a constant debate, especially in the healthcare. We need more doctors, need more nurses, need more practical licensed nurses. And obviously that's the case in most of your countries. Despite of this debate, we need to solve that as soon as possible, like I said, because the number of elderly people, and they are the group that need more and less intensive healthcare. And the second question about the private sector, it was the public sector that drove these changes in Iceland and perhaps in most of your countries. The private sector was much more negative in reducing working hours. And it's also an interesting aspect in Iceland, at least. This discussion was in so many cases bypassed the politician. I used to be a politician. The main changes of reduction working hours in Iceland were made through negotiations between trade unions and federations of employees. We hardly never discussed this in the parliament. They literally just told us, the people in parliament, we have reached an agreement, you have to implement it in laws. So that was an interesting thing. So the politics didn't get in a way, but it didn't get involved as well. So that's an interesting aspect in my view. About the third question that I got from you, if I understand it, reducing cost, no, they did not reduce cost in the welfare system. And the healthcare, we are getting, the healthcare system in Iceland is getting more and more expensive, but obviously just because of the need, we are getting older and the technology it's getting more expensive, the medicine is getting more expensive. So, but this idea of reducing working hour, in the beginning it was introduced, it shouldn't be able to, the purpose was not to cost anything, but obviously it did cost something. And in many cases, for example, for my trade union, which is about 90% women, and many of them were in 80% employment rate, we expected that most of them would just have the same level of work and get 100% salaries. But in our experience, many of these nurses, practical nurses, they literally just decreased the working hours. So they went into 60% employment rate, maintained the same salaries. So obviously that caused the need to hire more people in that regard. But we don't have the people, so that's a problem that we haven't found a solution. So.
Okay, maybe Francisca, would you? It's the same question of the cost.
The cost, yeah, the financing in this organization, they were subsidized, so they got they had like 5-year plans that were subsidized for 5 full years, and they should like allocate it according to the plans they had already, but the 4-day, like the collective working time reduction was an idea they had already, that they wanted to work around, and then they have some like a budget to work around the topic. And they decided to finance the trial with this money. But then for the permanent reduction since 2022, they had to have a look at the financial question, because this was going to be permanent, so this would cost a lot of money. And they made the calculations like, okay, what is possible for us? That was not a 30-hour work week, that was a 32-hour work week. How exactly they all did that, I don't know. But there were some, because this was in the Belgian media, and they stopped communicating about it because there was a lot of critiques from, I don't know who, but like, this is a subsidized organization and they're gonna work less with our money, that kind of thing. So it is hard, but they really rethought it, and they didn't like increase their subsidies. It was just, it remained the same, but they thought like, okay, what is possible with the money we get? And that's 32 hours, but more, I don't know more about that, but that's what I've heard from them, what they told me. I think there was a question on measuring intensification. That's a hard one. We always say like, we first have to define intensification. What is it exactly that we mean? And I think there's a lot of different definitions for work intensification. We had a lot of things in our survey, like time pressure, work tempo, work pressure, like a lot of these things were in there. But that's like, of course, asking how satisfied are you? How do you feel? But I think intensification is something subjective. Like some people might be able to handle it better and don't feel a lot of work stress, while other people with the same work might feel it. So it is kind of subjective, but using time use data, we are able to objectify it a little bit because we know exactly how much time they spend on every task, so we can see the tempo, if the tempo is higher, because if there's a lot of shorter tasks after after each other, that's a sign of work tempo. But also if there's no breaks in between, you can see that the work tempo is quite high. So that's a more objectified way. And then I think, of course, in surveys, if we work with surveys, with a lot of us only work with surveys, I think using scales is probably the best way to go. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I was also thinking about that. That was kind of what I wrote down in my notes, which is, yeah, I think, as you said, what is work intensification, and having a clear idea of how you want to measure that from the onset. So can you have a baseline? Are these related to, is this related to sick leave? Is this related to kind of health and safety measures? Are there, you know, what other ways can this be looked at besides kind of qualitative or self-reported feedback, and kind of, you know, continually measuring in that way? I mean, there's also, you know, it is kind of subjective, but, you know, how are you interfacing with workers? Kind of what is the platform? How much power do they have to kind of report that back out? You know, what are those, where is the agency in that? And so that those conversations can happen. But yes, it is complicated. And then I'm also going to answer the public education question. So I think the question here is also, how big are we dreaming? So especially within the UK, you know, with austerity measures and kind of reduced public services and kind of funding, that is also a huge part of the problem. And so when we talk about work time reduction, it is in the context of all these other things and economic factors we're considering, particularly related to education, where, you know, labor supply, retaining employees, recruitment, that's such an issue. That is one of the, you know, often strongest benefits of work time reduction, is that you know, specific sectors can become more ideal, more desirable. It can help with retaining, but that can also be, you know, complicated given then if you have, you know, you don't have the labor supply to even move towards work time reduction. How do you do that? So yeah, I know you're nodding your head. You're like, that's exactly what I expected you to say. And I think, you know, it has been mentioned by Ágúst as well, which so much of it is also about, you know, having the level of staffing that you need from the onset as well. And if, you know, you're already overworked, work time reduction is only going to really make that more intense and be a problem and compound on itself. So unhelpful response, but there, and related kind of to, you know, maybe related to this, you know, again, how big are we dreaming? But that's, you know, what we've been saying, which is, what does the public sector reflect? And if you redesign the school year, you know, and obviously that is a big you know, that's not something that's just going to happen overnight. But if you look at that and you say, I want public education to match the ability to have a, you know, shorter working week for teachers, but we can maintain kind of like student engagement, or if this is matching kind of the whole labor market. But then that goes more into, again, how big are we dreaming? So, yeah.
I was gonna say the same. As I'm a sociologist, I'm not with the labor union, so you are mostly looking at practical things to what can we do and how can we pressure this maybe in organizations. But eventually, when we talk about the bigger picture, that's also what this organization was talking like. Ideally, we have a collective shorter work week for everyone, but that would mean different collective temporal rhythms in society. That would mean for everyone. Would that mean a three-day weekend? Maybe, but that would be the same for school-going children. They would also go to school only 4 days, so that would change the whole of society. So that's a different thing that if you want to do something with one organization, of course, they're gonna like be in conflict with some temporal rhythms that are based on a 5-day week as we know it. But if the bigger picture is we want to collectively go to a 4-day week, then we have to rethink the whole of society, which was the key of FEMA, because gender equality will not come from only women going to a 4-day week, or and I think gender equality won't even come if also men go to a 4-day week. Like there's a lot more that has to change around gender norms and gendered patterns. But that's part of this bigger dream that we are dreaming, maybe. So it is like all encompassing. It's so hard, but maybe we should sometimes dream more and start from there.
Yeah. Yes, before we come to this last participant with his there is a second one. I myself wanted to put one question to all of you. When I understood well, the main measure to avoid intensification seemed to be the very participative preparation of the experiment. Did I understand well? And could you maybe tell a little bit more about the concrete structuring of these preparation phases?
Good evening, citizens. My name is Angelos Charlaftis, EPAFOS Advisors, who represent the EcoWaves movement, a pan-European and Mediterranean movement, which is based in direct democracy, citizens' assemblies and lotting procedures, science and societies of knowledge, and arts and ecology. It's a meta-capitalistic post-communism movement for the future. So today, the audience, as we call the citizens here, they are totally different from last year, as I told to Agnieszka. And usually we are participating to the TUI events, where we have a lot of times told our vision about the future, which will be a common work between the machines, the automaton machines, the smart machines, and the humans. So the 4 days week, or even 5 hours week, is achievable with the assistance of slavery, of the new slavery of the machines. Because the new slaves will not be humans, will be the machines, as Aristotle mentioned, because he was asked when the slavery is going to end, and he answered when the architect is going to direct the automaton and the automaton is going to execute. So we salute your community here, and we hope that you are going to be engaged with our movement. We see that the 4-day week is achievable, of course, with a lot of experimentation. Iceland is doing very good work. Of course, health needs other things, and the robotics, which already in the ASEAN countries, they are implementing with the health systems. So the thing is, what do you have to say about the anti-work movement? Because, of course, we have to think what is the work of the future with the robotics and the artificial intelligence. and how our humanity, our human nature is not going to be endangered. Thank you very much.
I had the same question. No, that's just a joke. A very practical question, a very short question. Do you think because success is not so easy? So we have seen that people who are in the pilot, nobody wants to go back, okay, but I also conclude that it's not easy and there are some nuances. So my question is, do you think that we need external guidance, support, consultancy to guide you through the preparation phase, to give you some support? Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. How to avoid intensification, and also maybe a link to the last question. Obviously, we need to analyze the best practices and meet together in a conference like this and share our experience and talk about what works and what doesn't work. From the Icelandic perspective, like I said before, where the implementation of reduction of the working hour succeeded, and in some cases the intensification wasn't the problem, it almost entirely relied on the preparation. And the preparation is to talk to the employees. We saw that in the trials where the director came from above. Let's do it that way. That didn't work as well. Where we had other organizations where the directors and the head of the management were properly trained and they talked to employees and allowed the employees to participate in the decision making, in the planning, allowing some flexibility. Obviously, that not the same thing applies to a hospital or to a office that close in the noon in Friday, for example, like you talked in Stockholm. The needs are different. So the key to success is preparations, open communications, and allowing the people on the floor to have some saying how to implement these changes. Obviously, I emphasize the need of staffing. That's a huge thing. But put that on a side, we have to prepare people for these dramatic changes. And obviously, like Francisca said, it's also influence how we look at society, how it interact, for example, daycare, kindergarten, and et cetera, et cetera. Somebody needs to think about marginalized groups that are not able to only work 7-8 hours a day. We saw it on the local level, for example, in Iceland. Some local levels, the first 6 hours in kindergarten are free, and the last 2 hours are very expensive. The middle class in Iceland, it's very easy to have only 6 hours working day. But poor people, the lower middle class, immigrants, they have to work for 8 hours or 9 hours, and they had to pay much higher fee for kindergarten. So that's a drawback that some politicians at the local level didn't anticipate. So we need to look at the big picture, as Francisca said. Thank you.
Echo a lot of what Ágúst said, but yes, so much kind of that participative preparation that you mentioned, Margareta, definitely. I agree with kind of that kind of collective buy-in, which I think was like a buzzword I used a few times. But so what that looks like when we are working with organizations who are in that preparation phase, that's, as Ágúst mentioned, it's really talking to workers. So we will conduct surveys, we'll participate in workshops where we're moving through kind of what are the different models that make most sense for specific teams, for specific workers, what are the specific, flexible models that already exist. Are people, what's the level of part-time staff? How are their flexible working arrangements? So really getting to the more granular level of the day-to-day within the workplace, and also having a clear sense of what are the objectives. What is the point of moving to work time reduction? Who is instigating this? Is this employer-led in the sense that, they want to move this because they want higher productivity, and therefore what are workers' perspectives on that? Or is this kind of being an initiative being pushed for our workers workers to have kind of higher well-being and things like that. And something also kind of that we find related to, you know, that participatory kind of environment to prepare is that organizations with higher levels of trust typically do better, because that is where that communication can be more robust. And if you already are struggling with kind of levels of trust within a workplace, it can become a bit more punitive, or kind of high levels of monitoring can negatively impact that. So yes, to what you said about participative preparation, but also kind of with nuances there about kind of what is already happening. I will jump to the third question really quickly about success is not easy and kind of the role of external guidance. So that is something that we do at Autonomy. We are a consultancy and we work with organizations kind of individually, though I would say that that is something that organizations and companies should be able to have resources to as well. You know, like understanding what does preparation look like? How do they need to interact with their workers? And kind of in an ideal world that's not limited to like one-on-one kind of consultancy. And that's kind of we're creating, as we keep going back to, like a larger cultural shift where we can make that happen. So yes, but I do think kind of that level of preparation is really centering kind of those worker perspectives, but also understanding the limitations. What are the red lines? What are things that must be maintained for the organization or for the company? And then lastly, to kind of the use of machines and kind of a post-work future, I will also say kind of what we're seeing now related to kind of AI and automation is right now kind of the robots are here to take our jobs is less of the case in many industries, but kind of algorithmic management is happening a lot. So we see kind of the role of robots and AI becoming more of the manager themselves, and therefore they are impacting the work quality of many workers. And that is also can be a concern. And so when we're looking at the kind of quality jobs that we have, and so sometimes and often automation can make the quality of jobs worse, more mundane, more controlled, more punitive. And so I think there's a kind of conversation about what is the role of automation and what it looks like, but also under whose context and kind of what is the worker platform to advocate for what they want, and whether automation is even a part of that, and if it is, where. So yes, that would be my thoughts on that. Francisca?
Yes, I think the preparation phase is very important. At FEMA, they also took, I think they started with the idea in 2016, beginning 2017. They trialed in 2019. So that's 2 years of preparation in which the employees were very involved. They organized like a group of employees who were able to rethink how they were going to do things. So I think that's very important to have a long enough period and the involvement of the employees. But guidance from outside, they did work with a consultancy firm and it did not work well. The consultancy firms, I think they did not have experience with shorter work weeks. I don't know. So that's different from you guys. But they said like, oh yes, it's a self-managing team. You can introduce it in 3 months. That's what they said. Did not work. And what I've heard from them, and I think that's also true, organizations know themselves best. I think they know best what works. Of course, it's interesting to hear from how other organizations did it, have a network maybe to contact and be informed of how can we do it, but then still think like what works for our company. Maybe it's not the same as another company. So I think it's important to have that network and maybe some insights, but still like listen what they would say. The manager said we had to listen. I wish we had listened to our gut that this wasn't going to work, but they said, yes, it will work. So we did it and we took distance from it. But sometimes you just have to like talk with your employees and see what feels best for your organization, I think. And then the anti-work movement, it's very philosophical, I think, to start here. It's like, I'm not an economist, but I think Keynes said we would be working 15 hours by 2030. That was mainly because of technology, he said. And I think yeah, it hasn't happened because of like neoliberalism, capitalism, how it has evolved, and consumerism. So I think these things we have to keep in mind. And you could say I am a fan of the anti-work movement as long as it says like it's about work as we know it today. Because work, if you have a good job, good work, it is beneficial. It has its benefits. You have like contact with others from without your circle. You have routine in your. So it is very important. Work isn't bad, but some work is bad, and in some contexts, like maybe too long. Working hours are too long, and the society has changed. Maybe work has to change. So I'm not a big fan of like, oh, work isn't good at all, but maybe we should change how we look at work and what work means.
Okay, so many thanks to all our 3 speakers. Wonderful. And now I will pass the word to India for the last organizational remarks for the day and tomorrow.
Great. Thank you, Margareta, and thank you to all of our speakers today and our moderators as well, and all of our live interpreters as well. Thank you very much for all of your work. We will be reconvening here at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Sessions will start at 10:30, so you can come back for more hot drinks and mingling. There is a dinner this evening, but only if you've pre-registered for it can you attend, I'm afraid, just because there's limited capacity. If you're confused whether you're on the list or not, please come and ask me. I have it printed out. And we will see if anyone who's going to the dinner, we will meet there at 7. And yeah, we've got some more hot drinks, I think, and we've got the space until around 5, so feel free to stay a bit. If not, then we will see you all tomorrow. Thank you very much for coming.